Hello, everyone, and welcome to Black Lives, Atticus Finch, and the Ethics of Legal Fictions. I'm Marcus Benning, a 2L at Duke Law School and alum of Duke University. I'm currently serving as the president of the Black Law Students Association. And before we get started, we'd like to thank our sponsors, the Center on Race, Law, and Politics, the Program in Public Law, the Black Law Students Association, the Black Students Alliance, and the Duke Council on Race and Ethnicity.
Hi, my name is Henry Washington. I am a junior in the Trinity College of Arts and Sciences, where I have double majors in English and African American Studies, and my minor is political science. This year I'm serving as the president of the Black Student Alliance, and where Marcus serves kind of a legal purpose, I present more of a literary perspective, but I think perhaps where we overlap is that both of our thinking has been rooted in questions of Black life and identity. So I will take this time to introduce Professor Karla Holloway, who is the James B. Duke Professor of English here at Duke, holding appointments also in the law school, women's studies, and African American studies. Her research and teaching interests focus on African American cultural studies, biocultural studies, gender, ethics, and law. Professor Holloway has authored numerous books and publications, the most pertinent to this conversation being Legal Fictions, Constituting Race, Composing Literature, which engages the intentional, contradictory, and capricious constructions of race. From Linda Brown to Barack Obama to Tom Robinson, whose supposed rape of Mayella Ewell is the cohering narrative of To Kill a Mockingbird, Legal Fictions argues that Black bodies are both literarily and historically bound by law's theory and practice.
And I'll be introducing Professor Katharine Bartlett. So Professor Bartlett is the A. Kenneth Pry Professor of Law and served as Dean of the Law School from 2000 until 2007. She teaches family law, employment and discrimination law, gender and the law, and contracts, and publishes widely in the fields of family law, gender theory, employment law, the theories of social change, and legal education. She has published the leading case book along with Deborah Rode in the areas of gender law. Professor Bartlett earned her degrees at Wheaton College, Harvard University, and the University of California at Berkeley. Before coming to Duke, she was a law clerk for the California Supreme Court, and we'll also note that Professors Bartlett and Holloway co-teach a class on race and literature this semester. So now I'll provide some context for our discussion and get started. So To Kill a Mockingbird, written by Harper Lee, was published in 1960 and became one of the most well-known and popularly debated novels in history. This summer, 65 years later, another novel, Go Set a Watchman, was discovered and published. Go Set a Watchman is believed to be Mockingbird's sequel, set 20 years after Mockingbird, also from the perspective of Finch's daughter, Jean Louise, known affectionately as Scout. After Go Set a Watchman was released this summer, there was controversy about whether Lee had the capacity to consent to the book's publishing at 89 years old, partially deaf and blind. The debate ensued about the duties of Lee's attorney as well, but most importantly, there was debate about the plot of Watchmen and what it revealed about the famed attorney, Atticus Finch.
But this controversy extends beyond just the literary reimagination of Atticus Finch and the ethics of the novel to include questions about the actual narrative sequencing of the two texts. According to the publishers at HarperCollins, Go Set a Watchman was written by Lee before Mockingbird, and upon turning in the draft that would become Watchmen, Lee's publishers suggested that she focus more on the already present flashbacks of Scout during her childhood. Now, different scholars have argued, some suggesting that the publishers at HarperCollins were concerned about the explicitness of the racial tensions described in the book and felt that anchoring the story around the youthful Jean Louise, Scout, would offer a narrative that was easier to digest given the racial politics of the time. America is introduced to Atticus Finch in Mockingbird. He is known for representing a falsely accused Black man on trial in Alabama during the 1930s for the alleged rape of a white woman, Mayella Ewell. Despite Finch's efforts, Robinson is found guilty by the jury, but still has been heralded as a hero of racial equality, which I have some contention with, but we'll talk about that later. For years, people around the U.S. and the world admired Atticus. Ghost of the Watchman, however, displays a more sober characterization of Atticus, no longer merely heroic, but also complexly human. A white man in the Jim Crow South who is not quite ready for integration, much to the dismay of his daughter, who throughout Mockingbird sees her father as a morally righteous hero without blemish. Scout is left to reimagine her father and the audience to reimagine its hero. So just to orient my own comments and kind of how I arrived at interest in this topic and in this conversation, I do come with some background for the novel. So I don't remember exactly when, but at some point in my adolescence, To Kill a Mockingbird, I'm from Alabama also to provide that context, which of course is where the novels are set. I encountered To Kill a Mockingbird as required reading in an English class. I also come to this conversation with a literary disposition, as literature is both my passion and my study of choice here at Duke. Finally, I would say because of my experiences as a Black male in America and a Black student leader on Duke's campus, I come to this conversation with my Black righteous mind. These texts and this controversy arouse all three of the contextualizing viewpoints I've mentioned: my historical memory, my literary interest, and my racial consciousness. Now, before we delve into what I hope will be an intersectional conversation around the implications of the literary phenomena at play, I want to underscore the richness of narrative construction in both of the texts that make possible the conversation we are having today. Take, for example, the moment in To Kill a Mockingbird when Scout recalls her father saying, "It is a sin to kill a mockingbird." The mockingbird, the literary symbol on which the novel's entire meaning is hinged, becomes an impetus by which we consider the socio-political murderousness of systematic oppression and social determination. All literary thoughts that are inherently caught up in legal and ethical realities. True to the fictional form, the novel exploits made-up narrative as a means by which to extract social, cultural, political, and legal meaning. But it is the fiction, I want to remind us, the literature that foregrounds these intellectual possibilities.
That was powerful. Like Henry, for the past few weeks, I've had the privilege, in his case, being reintroduced, but I've been introduced to Harper Lee and this timeless literary classic, To Kill a Mockingbird. I found the book and its sequel, Ghost of the Watchman, right on time, as I'm grappling with legal concepts and developing my approach to the law. For law students, this is a very fitting time to reflect on the struggles of the lawyer Atticus Finch and of his falsely accused client, Tom Robinson. What I learned from these novels is that if we practice long enough, or if we live long enough, we'll all have an Atticus moment, when following our moral convictions may have dire consequences, but we need to figure out what to do. The good thing is that we don't have to wait until we're practicing to begin sharpening our awareness and responses to injustices that we notice around us. We can engage through our student group work or observe the activism of our professors through their work, just as the young Jean Louise observed her father, Atticus. I think there's something we can all learn from the idealistic Jean Louise. She was willing to imagine. Ghost of the Watchman calls into question whether her father was really who she imagined him to be. But nevertheless, she was willing to imagine what wasn't as if it were. In truth, Atticus was human and not just heroic, but Jean's consciousness was formed with the hero in mind. She saw and expected the best of him. As Duke Law students, we must be willing to reimagine Duke and to reimagine the world, to seek and expect the best of this place, and to thrust that vision into reality with our activism. And this is how the Black Lives aspect of the program's title relates to Atticus and Mockingbird. Yes, there are obvious parallels between the falsely accused Tom Robinson and the unarmed Black men who have shared Tom's fate throughout our country's history and present. The story isn't new, and neither is our responsibility as future lawyers and scholars of all disciplines to determine our role in reimagining the world as a just and equal place. And with imagination in mind, we transition to our literary and legal scholars, Professors Holloway and Bartlett, who can set the scene for imagination better than any other. Why don't you all give your opening statements, and then we'll jump right into the questions.
Go ahead. Yeah, opening statement. So let me.
We are at Duke Law.
So let me address what I find to be interesting. I'm going to take your invitation to be sort of focused, I guess, on the literary, although I'm not sure that's going to be my strength. Focused to be on what I think is interesting about the controversy that's ensued from the publication of the second book, Go Set a Watchman. So what really interests me is this notion that Atticus Finch is someone that we feel like we own, a sort of an autonomous, if fictional character. And we own him in the sense that we can be disappointed if he's not who we thought he was. We own him in the sense that we can say, well, I knew him all along. He was always a racist, and I knew that. Or some other response. So people respond to him as this person who is a fictional character, as if, in fact, he is real. And I think that's because of the sort of iconic place that Atticus Finch plays in various narratives. So connection to law is a narrative, Black Lives is a narrative, what racial justice is a narrative. And so what all of these things mean, and I think where Karla, who's the expert in legal fictions, is that these narratives are driven in part from our literary heritage, from our fiction. And so we feel that there's a big stake in who Atticus Finch is because he was at one time our hero, or at least for many of us, our hero. It fed us the possibility that doing the right thing in a racial equality sense was possible and was our responsibility. And now we find out he's not who we thought he was. So I think that's the interesting, the fact that that the responses to Watchmen have been responses to who is the real Atticus Finch, I think is interesting in that regard.
Before I start, in response to that and also your invitation to think about this intersectionally, I do want to thank the intersectional groups that came together to have us in conversation. I will claim this is Kate's idea, and I hope she's still glad about it, but this comes from our having taught together before and engaged these very issues. And also, this is just the best of Duke, when its faculty and its students, both graduate, professional, and undergraduate, can come together in conversation. So I love this moment because it emblematizes what we do best at Duke. I don't love the books. I actually, in reading Go Set a Watchman, that was my first live tweeting of my reading a book. I had to talk to somebody, so I found myself reading it and tweeting about it at the same time, and then finally deciding that the woman who wrote The Help, which Kate and I have also done a public conversation about, and Harper Lee should just get together and sit down and have a conversation. So I think that what runs in my head is Atticus, we hardly knew ye. Or maybe we did know him, and what we did instead was read him into the necessity of our social lives in the 1960s. Because what we needed from an America who was grappling with recent Supreme Court decisions, grappling with changes in our schools, in our neighborhoods, in our communities, was a hero who could cover both the ground of the social and the legal. And Atticus is, we debated about whether or not to bring Gregory Peck into this conversation because we see him in the movie, and there's this wonderful scene of Gregory Peck in the courtroom, but we also see this in extraordinary community of Macomb, Alabama. And that's the bridge, I think, of both landscapes, what that social world was like during that period to blacks and whites, although I'd argue that Black life was more imagined than real. in either of the novels, and what the legal world represented as a way to sort of bridge and help us understand and even manage what was happening in the communication, in the new legal space that the races could share because of recent legal decisions. So I'm struck by the way that this novel just sets up a perfect storm of the ways in which the legal and the literary come together. And almost every event in the novel, whether we focus it on Atticus or on Scout as the teller, allows us to think again about who we thought he was when we first read the story.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah.
Okay, so I agree that we needed To Kill a Mockingbird in 1960, that we needed some vision of what it meant to, for whites, I think it was written for whites, by whites for whites, to sort of open some doors about our thinking about our responsibility in living in a racist society. I also think that Atticus Finch, to a very important extent, remains a hero. That is to say, he walked the walk. He put his money where his mouth was, whatever metaphor you want to use. He actually took some risks to, as a lawyer, to engage in a society in a way that was not popular. And the fact that it turns out that his vision of racial justice was limited doesn't take anything away from the risks that he took in Mockingbird. Now, I think we also needed Watchman. And I'm very disappointed that it wasn't a better written book. It's a very poorly written book. It's hard to imagine that these two books were written by the same person, just in terms of the literary quality between the two. But setting that aside, talk about imagination. If we could imagine a better written Watchman, what Watchman seems to do in our time is say, wait a minute, it's not so easy to be non-racist. Wait a minute, you think you're enlightened, but think again. So it's sort of pulling back on, we can no longer kind of identify Atticus and think this is our hero and I'm going to live my life this way. It turns out it's much more complicated, much more difficult, and that we're all much more limited in what we understand about race from our various perspectives than we may think we are.
Well, and this is very interesting, which leads me to one of the questions that I was going to ask, because for me in the novel, or as the two narratives converge, we come to understand Atticus as a fixture of democratic reality as opposed to a fixture of racial equality. And we understand that his allegiance is to the law rather than to racial equality. And so I guess I'm interested in an extension of this question to say, does this new representation readers acquire of his racial politics point to narrative inconsistency or to our own misgivings about racism and prejudice for us to have believed that the Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird cannot be reconciled with the character that we see in Ghost of the Watchman?
I actually think he can be reconciled, but my quick answer is it's both of those. You know, it's a misreading, but it's a necessary misreading that can find some reconciliation between the two characters, or between, like they're two different people. But they were a child's view of her father and an adult's view of her father. But I have written that I think we read Mockingbird poorly. Because if we read it well, we would always have known that he was going by the letter of the law, that he was instructed to take up this case, that he believed in the law, not in a sort of, well-integrated black and white sociality that was in a racial imagination that we read the novel into. So Atticus was always the Atticus I think that he is in Watchmen. It's just that our reading now goes back to say, is this a new character or did I miss it? I think we missed it, but I think we missed it for good reason because, as Professor Bartlett said, we were reading for a particular era, and we always read with our own imaginations engaged in what the text ought to say.
Well, speaking of our own era, so Atticus.
And that's our era,
Yeah, well, let's not bring attention to that fact.
Okay, all right. My era.
So,
I'm claiming.
so Atticus, if we can personalize him, was also a figure of his time. And point of fact is that the movement for racial equality, I want to say began, that's too strong a statement, but the law was the leader, and the law was an extremely important force. And so you have Atticus representing in the 1960s, which was a very progressive view, which was, we got to change the law because we've got all white juries convicting innocent black men, and we just, this doesn't stand any test of fairness or justice. Alongside a sentiment that still accepted Jim Crow, that still accepted that blacks and whites don't need to sit down and have dinner together, that they certainly don't date and marry and go to the same churches and whatever. So that was his time. So this was a progressive stance at his time, and it was a time in which law was beginning to be used ahead of people's sentiments.
Oh, I agree.
Way ahead of these, not only the people in this small town, but in other parts of the country. And sort of the amazing thing is how the law could press on in the direction, at least it had to do with trials and courts and things, and make as much progress as it did, when everybody, even the people like Atticus Finch who were pressing on, had these unbelievable views about race.
Or believable.
But today, unbelievable, unbelievably limited views about the possibility of racial equality.
Can we talk more about context and audience? You mentioned a little bit earlier that, so we're reading that Mockingbird was intended for a white audience by a white author. So given kind of shifting racial dynamics, but that the tensions have remained in terms of racial dynamics in the country, who do you think is the target audience for Watchmen?
I think it's still whites.
I totally agree, but I think that
there aren't black. Excuse me, but
No,
there aren't black agents in this. Almost the closest we get is Calpurnia, who in Mockingbird, someone said could have come off the illustration off a bag of flour.
Jemima.
Actually, very nurturing towards Scout and her brother. Completely on board. And Atticus was a hero. Completely unqualified acceptance of her place in society. In Watchmen, starts. Of course, Scout now is an adult, but there's this terribly written exchange between them where Scout goes to Calpurnia's house. And Scout's looking for the usual reassurance, kind of childish need for reassurance that she always got when she was growing up in Calpurnia's house. And Calpurnia basically, backs off. And she said, and Scout says to her, "What are you doing to us? Okay, what are you doing to us? What are you doing to me by sort of seeming to reject me this way?"
Good point about agency.
And also says, "Do you hate us? Does it turn out that you hated me all along?" And the book says, and Calpurnia shook her head.
I love that.
And I think that's very ambiguous because I don't know whether she's shaking her head yes or no.
And that was the part that reminded me of Catherine Stockett's book, The Help, where the need to know whether or not you were loved as a white child growing up being cared for by black women seemed to just jump over into a whole nother book. Did you really love us? And I love the way, that might be the only line that I'll give to Lee in this book, that she shook her head. And I remember tweeting, yes, no, what? But I also want to note that Calpurnia's reading material was really interesting. She was reading Blackstone's commentaries, because there's also an exchange about how Calpurnia speaks standard English rather than non-standard English. And there's a whole another poorly written section about that. But we find out that because she's living in the house of a lawyer, her casual reading material is Blackstone. So, and Harper Lee had at least 1 year of law school before she dropped out. So the law is intentionally a structure in this book, but I love the way you said, because I agree with it totally too, the way the law sort of led us and I would argue bound us into this sort of racialized structure that we're still working through today. So when we come to your question about what's going on around today's audiences, when I bring a Black life audience to it, not that I didn't when I read Mockingbird in the beginning, I always wondered, Tom Robinson, can we talk about him a bit? He died, he was shot escaping from prison, and there's this much given to whatever those emotions are, which is not unlike the erasure of the importance of Black lives today in those same situations, whether or not, I call them, are they grievable deaths? Can we spend some time considering what they mean? So what a contemporary what a contemporary conversation can be about it, because Black folks were reading this book, and we were assigned it in school as well, but we didn't have the chance for this kind of wonderful moment for conversation. And I think what happens today is that we can excavate these Black lives from the ones that Harper Lee did give to us, but she didn't know what to do with them either. I mean, she was as much implicated by that era as everyone else.
So, yeah, I think I'd like to call even more attention to this kind of erasure that we're describing, just because, okay, we understand that Atticus Finch is a product of his time, but I guess I'd like to critique the critical reception of the novel as it has transcended decades and generations of people. Because the audience that reads To Kill a Mockingbird up to date, I think champions Atticus Finch as just as much a hero of racial justice as the audience that read it in 1960. I'm interested in your response to that.
So I don't know. I don't know how it's taught now. I mean, I reread it for this panel. I wanted to reread it anyway, just to think it was, could it have been as well written as the person, as this book by the same author. So I marveled at how beautifully written it is. I just finished Watchman. You go back and read two. I mean, it's just hard not to be overwhelmed, I think, by how beautifully it was written. I don't know. It doesn't go to your question at all. I just don't know what people who are teaching it now, if it's even still taught. Now, Marcus, you had to wait until last week to read this novel, so I'm not sure. Is this novel still taught?
Oh.
So what is it?
I mean, she's still getting significant royalties.
So I would be interested if, I don't know if now is the right time or some other time, I would be interested in hearing from some people who have studied it as much closer to now than I have. What were you taught with this book? The mics aren't on, so we'll have to repeat what you say. So make it easy to repeat.
Any comments? So we'll go here and then there.
So I was actually a little bit frustrated that Atticus was viewed as a hero because it seemed to me, in high school, and at least the people I was discussing it with, that people used Atticus to maybe dissociate themselves from a responsibility to do what he did. And viewing it very much as like, well, this should be everyone's responsibility to, undertake the kinds of things that Atticus did to, put ourselves out there, rather than just like leaving that territory for a hero, higher than society or, any individual could attain.
And I like your point about, being frustrated with his automatic rise to heroic stature. I think that, to contextualize it, I think in the 60s, his heroism was more necessary than it might have been although I was just a child, in the 70s or 80s or 90s, or, couldn't have been that much of a child. So this notion of when we were able to read his heroism, I've always resisted it as well, but I wonder if I also read the novel looking at the black Black folk on the other side of town in Calpurnia, and her sons or grandsons or the church scene, with more interest in getting more there, and was sort of resentful that even a story told by a young woman became the story of her father. So, how did Scout disappear in this telling and our interest in her? Who knows who played Scout in the movie, but I remember Gregory Peck as Atticus Finch. So I think that this is gendered, his rise to heroism. I also think it's raced in terms of a sociality that needed some sort of interlocutor, and he became it without a kind of critical thought that the book offered. He was instructed to take the case. He did as much as the law would allow. And in Watchman, when he gets the Black case, he says, I'll immediately have the character plead guilty. It's a DWI in Watchman. And he kills a man. And I think the young man is the grandson or the son of Calpurnia. Is this right? Grandson of Calpurnia. And none of you as law students would immediately go to a guilt for, being the lawyer appointed to defend this man who said, first thing is, we're going to have him plead guilty. So there you see him sort of abdicating some of his responsibility to a potential client. And if this book was written first, I have to wonder why in the first book she would have the client plead guilty, and then the story of the second book becomes Tom Robinson in a much more complicated way.
Can we talk more?
Well, he did it. The guy was guilty in Watchmen and innocent in Mockingbird.
Yeah,
So
but I don't think a defense attorney would first go, for guilt.
So given those kind of like legal dynamics there, we have an innocent Tom Robinson. Now we have a guilty via the conduct in the second book. Can we talk more about Atticus and his heroism? What do we expect of our heroes? Do we allow our heroes to make mistakes? And if they do make mistakes, or if they do things that we don't agree, is it still fair to consider them heroes, or do they lose that status?
And I'm also interested if anyone in the audience champions Atticus Finch, a hero of racial justice.
The way you asked that question was
I was like, is anyone brave enough?
But folks can just speak candidly about what Atticus means to you as a hero, huh?
Yeah.
Or not?
That underestimates the social tension of his appearing before the mores of the people that don't want to have this case decided at all and don't want it to be treated, and that tension is always there. He's violating the mores of the people. I don't know why you underestimate the importance of this. He's doing it anyway, whereas another lawyer would have begged off or done something that would have appealed more to the mores and won the approval of his peers.
Well, it's not really clear whether Atticus had a choice.
He could have, if we know the way those things work, which we all do, he could say, no, pass it on to the next lawyer.
Or pro forma.
Or a pro forma representation. And he gives a passioned defense. But I wonder if there's a difference between heroism and courage. Because one of the things that he wants to do is set a model for his children. He says throughout the book that, the way he lives in the courtroom is the way he wants to live in his community. And that's the ethics of the matter. And I think that I see him as extraordinarily courageous through several scenes of the novel. But I think I would resist heroism. And I'm not quite sure why yet, but I'll let Kate.
Well, I just can't get out of my mind, and I apologize for the religious reference, but I heard a sermon on a passage from Mark on Sunday, and it's where Jesus asks his disciples, who do they say that I am? And then he looks to Peter and says, who do you say that I am? And then, of course, the next question would be, who do we say that we are? And to me, Atticus, it's not just about who Atticus really is, but who... well, maybe it is about what he really is, but the importance here of who he's reflected to be, what he, as I think that's a really good point about so much of what Atticus does, he says, I'm doing this because I can't imagine looking you in the face if I don't. I can't imagine looking at my children. He says this to his sister, who's much more racist than he is. I can't imagine continuing to raise my children if I don't stand for this. If the who do you say that I am? If who do they think that I am isn't this? And so I think that's to me that's kind of heroic. And I think I'm willing to modify what we expect of our heroes to be. To take account not only the time that they were in, but also the difference between what you think and are willing to talk about with your friends, and then, and Marcus, you alluded to this earlier, and what you're actually willing to put yourself on the line and show yourself to be, which is sometimes, uncomfortably public and exposed. Especially if you like everybody to like you, which is, my preferred state of being. And so, I think every religion must have some version of this, which is questioning what you stand for to others and who you are in terms of your family and to yourself. And I think that that these books together really kind of compel a consideration of that whole set of issues.
That's a beautiful way to teach these books, to think about, is this doing what we want to be normative? You behave in public as you would want to behave in public. You do for others as you would have, you know how that one works. She's been to church more recently.
Do unto others as you would have them do unto yourself.
That one. And we want that to be our normative culture, and that's what we expect and would hope would always happen. And for me to stretch, so I'm a bit less willing to say I want that to be heroic. I want heroic to be something more extraordinary than that. But I do like to go back to the way the law gives us that opportunity to choose that kind of conduct, to be that kind of ethical being where, he might be, in the new book, the new old book, Atticus is head of this White Citizens Council, which is, a version of the Klan. So we know he has and there's a long, complicated discussion about the place of the races. So it's very clear where his social politics lie. But it's the law that makes him a better person than even his character.
Now, am I right?
Represents.
I think they meet in the courthouse.
Speaking of law. Speaking of law, they meet in the courthouse without the hoods.
And it reminds me of the passage that's in To Kill a Mockingbird, and I feel like I'm going to butcher it, but it says it's about standing in another man's shoes.
Yeah.
It's that you can't understand a man's experience unless you stand in his shoes, which makes me, I have to exploit this opportunity to ask a question about if this might have particular resonance for how we conceptualize allyship for this current moment in the Black Lives Matter movement, especially as a lot of the frustration that I hear from Black students and Black activists is that the role of allies is sometimes over-asserted or over-determined.
Oh, do I not want to talk about that? But because I'm not sure about it. I want movements to have multiple and diverse bodies representing a principle. Mm-hmm. And I don't want movements to be owned by certain bodies. So the Black Lives Matter, for example, boy, do I want Black Lives to matter to the police. And I would like to see a diverse and complicated group of persons articulating that as a principle. But I think the politics of how it circulates through public cultures right now calls on the kind of disparities in who says what or who gets to be the principal speaker. And when we get to that level, I think we've already lost some of the ethics of the principle. Mm-hmm. I think that, but I haven't thought about it enough.
So I'm a real believer in trying to stand in other people's shoes. And empathy is one of the critical components of racial justice, of emotional intelligence, and everything else that I value. So one of the things I think we can, on the one hand. On the other hand, one of the things I think we can fault Atticus for, I think one of the things that makes us uncomfortable about Atticus as a hero is that he is an educated white man out to save a poor black man who really needs him. So when we start talking about whose responsibility it is for what, there's a real razor-sharp high wire or whatever that from my position as a white person, I see too much patronizing. I see too much kind of, we're the one, this isn't going to happen without us. So, on the one hand, there's responsibility by everyone. On the other hand, it's so difficult sometimes to get the kind of alliance you need without the loss of agency that we referred to earlier, without thinking that this is sort of a noblesse oblige kind of responsibility. So I'm also
so it's complicated.
So for the same reason, yeah, somewhat.
And this reminds me of because one of the things that we appreciate about literature is that it allows us the possibility to reimagine historical realities, right? And so one of the things that I'm reminded of is that Harper Lee acquires a kind of agency in her narrative because of who she is. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking of like Toni Morrison's essay Home, where she talks about how she, as a black writer, is automatically put into a racial house, and her narratives are automatically delegitimized because of who she is. Mm-hmm. And so what's troubling about it is that I'm wondering, how do we conceptualize or how do we implement allyship in a way that isn't silencing to black voices?
Yeah, I think if we begin with the fact that this is troubled terrain and that it's complicated, we start off a lot more honest about with a lot more honesty around the situation, around the issue of allyship and whatever the principle might be. But I think too often we start off in camps or silos or whatever structures we've inherited, and that disallows the kind of complicated imaginary that Toni Morrison can do in literature, because there is no silo for Toni Morrison. She's out of it and flying, and as I often say, she invents characters that don't have navels. So once you do that, you are free of any, allegiance to reality. But literature does suggest to us what happens when we are free. And if we're free, do these structures that right now contain the ways we approach that right now there's a big diversity and inclusion conversation amongst the faculty at Duke, initiatives and things. Are we really free to reimagine that, or are we already set in in paradigms that will produce a result that's very familiar to us instead of, as Yeats said, make it new?
So I want to talk more about stepping into someone's shoes.
Yes.
That Professor Bartlett talked about earlier, and our ability to empathize, and if those are actually the same concepts, if it's even possible to imagine yourself in someone's shoes.
That's worth.
I don't have anything profound to say about that. I think it's literature is one of our main tools for being able to see ourselves around somebody else's narrative. So, I think that's a very powerful thing on the part of an author to be able to do, and that she does it very well. I saw the very interesting, not completely pertinent, but Smithsonian article on Harper Lee, and it turns out she's a recluse. She doesn't give interviews. She can hardly walk. Monroeville, population 6,000 or something, is the real place upon which Macomb is built. Does anybody know it? Anybody been there? Apparently there's gift shops with bobbleheads of Scout and Atticus Finch all over the place. And, it's all memorabilia related to...
there's one of Calpurnia.
Let's try to stay on subject. So, a very shy, introverted, recluse kind of a person can establish a voice in a very powerful way in this novel. So it's almost like we all have our role, and whatever you think of the job she did, she certainly created a way for people to understand some other people, even if those people were limited, like who isn't, to see things in a different way. It's a shame she didn't put us in the shoes of anybody but white people in that novel. That's not the novel she wrote, and not the shoes she stands in, but it does limit the novel.
In class the other day, I went in, and if you remember, the testamentary capacity was on the board, and the suggestion was, capacity might be the first thing we determine in, giving evidence in the trial, wherever. But in a novel, you can make someone's capacity limited or full. And I agree with you totally. That's why I think law and literature have to be understood as having a conversation with each other, because the things that are unimaginable or left out of a courtroom scene or, a testament or a document might be fully imaginable in literature. But Harper Lee's place in all of this is murky too. So
yeah, because the difficulty that I'm having is Atticus is. He's an advocate for empathy, for standing in someone's shoes. But how does one stand in one's shoes and advocate for due process of law in his trial, but not be able to stand in his shoes to say he deserves equal treatment or he deserves racial equality? I'm wondering, what are the limits? Like, if Atticus imagines himself as standing in the shoes of Tom Robinson, then how is he then still able to subject him to second-class citizenship?
the limit is the legal question.
Well, the limit is a human question. I mean, imagine what in 20 years our children or your children will be saying about the stupid things we believe right now.
Yeah.
And the stupid limitations we have about race or anything else for that matter. I mean, this is part of the human condition, that we're limited in our views and that it takes special kinds of insights that we get from different places, but literature is certainly one of them, about how to get out of the boxes that we're currently in. So to me, to say that that Atticus doesn't think that everything now that we enlightened people think about race is like, okay, it was 1960. This book was written in the mid-1950s. So it doesn't. It's not an apology for someone who thinks that, but it's a recognition of the time that he's in. And for me, the important thing is to have it be kind of a wake-up call for us. Well, what do we think? What do we think that's got the same kind of limits on it in terms of our understanding of other people, our ability to stand in their shoes, however you want to say it? You can be sure that there's some big ones. That there's some big items in that box.
As we were talking, then we'll transition into asking questions of the audience. I was thinking that perhaps instead of envisioning ourselves in other folks' shoes, we should just be content in our own shoes and just realize that certain conduct is wrong on its face. Professor Siegel?
Yeah, so I think it's a perfectly fair question to ask why Atticus shouldn't have more empathy for black people, but I think at the same time we have to ask ourselves why we can't have more empathy for him. He has been socialized in a deeply racist society. There's no way not to have racialized thinking to some extent in that environment. He doesn't just take the case that he could get out of it. He takes it and he is a zealous advocate for a condemned man. He puts his children's lives in danger. So we can have a debate about whether we should send our kids to schools that are of a lower quality because it's better for the community. He puts his children's lives in danger, not just in the courtroom, but by going to the family of Tom Robinson and saying we can appeal, right? This is not over. That's not just doing a job. So I can't tell you he's a hero, but it's possible for people who are not heroes to behave heroically. And this is the story of American constitutional history. Thomas Jefferson writes on that memorial, slavery is despotism, and I worry for the fate of our country. At the same time, he is deeply racist in his notes on the state of Virginia. The first Justice Harlan writes an eloquent, progressive opinion, the sole dissenter in Plessy against Ferguson. It's a deeply racist opinion. Eisenhower sends off the troops, right, in Cooper against Aaron to enforce the federal court order to desegregate. I don't even want to say publicly what he says to Earl Warren while Brown is pending about black people. And you can go on and on. We live in a fallen world. People are imperfect. People fight for racial equality and they're sexist. People fight for sexist equality and sex equality and they're willing to throw gay people under the bus. Right? So, I mean, I think Kate's question is the ultimate question, which is, where are our blind spots? What are we doing that the future is going to judge us for, just like we judge the past? But I don't think our standards can be moral perfection, and everyone's going to fail against that standard.
I want to make a point to that. I think that, so my personal reaction to Atticus is extremely complex. I empathize with Atticus. I empathize with the Mockingbird Atticus. My empathy with Atticus ends at Watchman, to some extent. Because at that point, Atticus shows himself to be a direct contradiction of his former self. Or maybe he is truly the same person.
But we see him more outside of the courtroom in Watchmen than we do in Mockingbird. The primary event in Mockingbird is that trial and the circumstances around it, and going to Robinson's house and telling the family that he is dead. And I agree that this is a courageous move. I still want to hold back until I finish thinking about what heroism means. But I also want to emphasize the way in which the law gives him a place and an orderly place to do each one of those things. And the next step is an appeal, which is absolutely appropriate according to the law. Did he have to take it? Did he have to go in that direction? He was an extraordinarily zealous lawyer for his client, which we would hope everyone would be. But
He was going to lose.
yeah, and notice in Watchmen, isn't the brief reference to the Robinson case that he won it? So, I mean, she chooses a completely different case in Watchmen to focus on quickly. So I'm stuck wondering what the conversation is with the editor when, that sends her back to the table. And also, just so we can engage it a bit, how a book went from something so meager, Watchmen, to something so lush, Mockingbird.
Well, there
in the same author.
Yeah, well, I mean, there
without
has...
Truman Capote.
The publisher's story is that this was written, that Watchman was written first, and they sent it back to the drawing board, and out came Mockingbird. It's really hard to read Watchmen and imagine that it could have been written first. It presupposes this whole hero. I mean, why would his downfall be interesting unless you knew that he was supposed to be a hero? To me, it just doesn't.
Except it's so much better. You don't write a terrible book after you wrote such a lovely book, unless you didn't have testamentary capacity.
Unless you're editors, maybe.
Somebody over here.
Unless you're editors. So, opening it up to the audience.
Let me just say one more thing. I wanted to say very quickly that I agree with your point, but I don't think that socialization and problematic ideologies, my problem with it is that it fails to lessen the impact on the marginalized groups. So even as I think about, in this context, the remnants of racial socialization in Alabama, the different kinds of ideologies that I was socialized to believe about myself as I was being raised does not then mean that the impact on those groups is unimportant.
Yeah. That's what colorblind, colorblind is suggested in Watchmen as Mrs. Scout's beautiful world that she resides in, but colorblindness allows you to miss the inequities of a society.
There's so much in so little time, but I have a few minutes if folks want to ask some questions or give their reactions or comments. I think we have someone in the front.
No, he wanted to speak earlier.
Okay.
Going off of a point that was said earlier about whether we feel empathy or not with with Atticus Finch. For me, it reminded me a lot of another racialized text that we read in school. It reminded me of Heart of Darkness, and how, like, you wouldn't necessarily feel empathy for Mr. Kurtz, but he reminds you that everyone has that capacity. And Atticus Finch, like, you thought of him as a hero, but he really has this not good social policies, and he really does not have great equal ideas. And it makes you think more about yourself and how you should, like, it reflects on you, and so how you should strive rather than empathizing with him. It makes you think about what you should be.
What you could do. I agree.
I think there was a hand in the back. Then we have another
In
one.
the center?
And then the
Sure.
center.
Thank you to the panel for a really wonderful conversation. One of the things that comes to mind in terms of empathy is that, as the professor from the law school was saying, that we don't have access to Black agency in either of these two novels. But I teach literature in the English department, and so from that perspective, I'm struck by how this novel that's done a particular kind of work in the second half of the 20th century for shaping our public imaginaries about what can we, what can the role be of a centered white male character. This novel also, I think, as we read it and notice the absence of other perspectives, might push us towards reading other novels and plays and poems in this moment that would give us access to a Black perspective on similar issues. James Baldwin's play, Blues for Mr. Charlie, comes to mind, as does Du Bois's idea of double consciousness, a kind of condition of empathy that Black people don't necessarily choose in a majority white society, to always be aware of their own perspective and of how the white world views them. So I'm curious if there are other texts that come to mind. I'm sure Professor Holloway has thoughts on this, but all of you love to read and think about literature as a way to access empathy. And what are some of the other places that Harper Lee might push us to look for those other perspectives and kind of get a richer sense of this moment and its relation to the present?
Well, without naming other texts, because of course, as you say that, everything goes out of my head, but I do want to say the 1960s was an especially vigorous time for Black literature in the United States. So it's interesting which novel becomes the Pulitzer Prize-winning darling of the one to teach us about racial injustice, and which novelists like Baldwin, like Ellison, like Wright, were also writing at those times and could also give us a view into a different perspective. So it says something to us about America, about where our racial palatability lies and where we want to get this particular message of potential harmony from. Not saying that these known for the period as protest writers were giving us this same palatable version, but this is certainly backtalk. There was certainly backtalk to this message that if we were more thorough readers, we could certainly have a kind of conversation like this.
Gosh, we are just about out of time. Thanks so much for coming out. All the co-sponsors will be interested in understanding what you think about this program and ideas for others. Please let us know.
Thank you all for being here. Good luck on that.